Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Webster Tarpley. On the war on Syria, heavy losses for the insurgents have occurred on the ground there. Many of the insurgents have actually been defeated by Assad's army, these terrorists who have wreaked havoc, destruction, and gross human rights violation in the country. Now, the Syrian army, some major investments it has made, like in Yabrud and Ras Al Ain, cutting off a major supply route for the insurgents from Lebanon. But the latest moves by the U.S. has brought speculation about a move towards regime change. The U.S. has ordered closed the Syrian embassy and its consulates. Is this a tit-for-tat move against Russia, or is the U.S. actually thinking of a military engagement? That question and more we're going to ask from our guests in this edition of the debate. Let me introduce them. Former U.S. diplomat George Lambrakis joins us from London. We have author and historian Webster Tarpley, who joins us from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. Webster Tarpley, let's first talk about the Army's advancements, the Yabrud win, closing supply routes for insurgents from Lebanon, and of course the Army killing recently of many of the insurgents. It seems like the insurgents are being defeated, and of course they are retreating. Is this the end game for them?
Louder.
Well, it may be. It may be certainly that that it's going to be the military end of the rebellion sometime this year, perhaps sometime in 2014. That can't be excluded. If we look at Yabrud, this is roughly comparable to the liberation of Qusair last June. So it's a very heavy blow to the logistics and the various infiltration pathways of these rebels coming in from Lebanon. It also frees that critical Damascus to Homs highway, which I've been up and down a number of times, and this was a position that allowed that to be blocked. There was also some talk in the newspapers here of a spring offensive by the rebels, but that has apparently not come about, and instead it's all going the other way. Now, if we look at that military front, we'll see that the moves by the United States and indeed by the Israelis are taken from a position of weakness. The closing of the embassy and consulate here in the United States, I think it's a pathetic, impotent gesture. Everybody knows that the goal was regime change the whole time. That's not news. And then at the same time, you've also got the Israelis coming out and once again showing that they're in effect the Al-Qaeda Air Force bombing some installations of the Syrian army. So it's also got to do with the Crimean crisis. About 10 days ago here, the Washington Post headline was that Assad is benefiting mightily from the clash over the Crimea, in the sense that Assad now is an absolutely indispensable ally of Russia, and he feels unhampered, unfettered, to do everything that's militarily necessary, everything that's militarily advantageous, and he doesn't have to worry about perhaps offending some faction in the Russian foreign ministry, because whatever those problems ever were, and I don't think they were ever that significant, that is all over now. The fronts have hardened, and Russia needs Assad significantly more, and he, of course, needs Russia. So on the whole, it's a very grim perspective for the rebels. And we can add in then that the Saudis are feuding with Qatar. There's a big fight over Al Jazeera. And you've even got the Nusra brigades in northern Syria ousting the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham. So there's a tremendous disarray in the logistical pipeline of the rebels, and we can even add in that the Turkish government is more and more reluctant to let the terrorist logistics go through Turkey. So on the whole, the spring campaigning season of 2014 starts on a very grim note for the rebels.
Yeah, and I can't see anything actually positive that's coming either politically or on the ground. Well, George Lambrakis, let's talk about this announcement by the U.S. in terms of the Syrian embassy being closed and two of its consulates. What do you make of it? Russia has come out and says that decision shows the U.S. is seeking regime change. Do you think that is what the U.S. wants? And does it mean a military offensive?
I'm not sure I understood your question completely.
Regime change is what Russia has said based on the U.S. announcement that Syrian embassy has to be closed, along with 2 of its consulates. Now, regime change, I'm asking you, does that mean that the U.S. is thinking about a military offensive?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just another way of showing unhappiness with the regime, which has caused, of course, so much harm to the population in Syria. And you've got about 2.5 million people moved around by the very strong, very tough regime effort against the revolutionaries. The fact that they've used poison gas, they use the planes, they use artillery. Most of that, of course, is collateral damage. And I think the United States is unhappy about it, but to answer your question directly, no, I don't think the United States, I don't think President Obama plans another military intervention in Syria. And I must say that the other speaker, I think, was pretty good in his analysis of what's happening on the ground. Unfortunately, the Syrian people are suffering as a result.
Well, let's talk about some of those points that you made, Webster Tarpley. There were a few of them. First of all, you talked about Saudi Arabia. Now, we know that when the Saudi Interior Minister Mohammed bin Nayef went to Washington, he talked to Obama. There's lots of analysis made on that visit in terms of how, first of all, obviously the Syrian file taken away from Bandar given to Nayef. But what I found interesting was one analysis that says that actually the United States and Saudi Arabia are now closer together regarding Syria, that they are actually going to coordinate themselves when it comes to the Islamic Front, spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, this group of I guess, groups under this umbrella group by the Islamic Front. And they're going to start, or if they haven't already, many say they have, giving them the game-changer weapons. But the problem is this came out on February 23rd, this analysis, and now we're looking at March, and things have changed on the ground. Is there any chance that Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Are going, well, not chance, but are they still under the impression that this war can be won militarily when, by all other counts, it's a war that should be won on the political side?
I think what we see here is, first of all, from the point of view of military reality, in terms of the actual relations of forces, it's kind of late in the day to think that you can come in with secret weapons or wonder weapons and somehow transform the situation. I don't think that's realistic. But naturally, the ruling elite of the United States, and unfortunately we have this Secretary of State, John Forbes Kerry, who comes from this infamous Skull and Bones secret society in Yale University in New Haven, which has caused so much destruction and so many disasters for the United States over the last 100 years with their mismanagement. My view is that these people are actually collectively insane, that Kerry marks a step down from somebody like Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice, of course, was a liar. She was a blatant, barefaced liar, but I think she generally knew that she was lying. In the case of Kerry, I don't know if he realizes that he's actually lying. And when he says things like Russia attacked Georgia, or when he says that all casualties, everybody who's killed in Syria is automatically a victim of Assad, when we know that there are terrorist death squads who have engaged in cannibalism and so forth. We know that we can see that this a group of people who have lost connection to reality, right? There's a debate about that, who's living in reality and who is not. And it seems to me Kerry is somebody who has lost his moorings. In terms of the specifics of shutting down the embassy, the U.S. pretext in the past 6 months was, we're concerned about chemical attacks on civilians. Well, if that were true, you'd want to keep a Syrian embassy here in Washington functioning so that you could coordinate the details of eliminating these chemical weapons. And the fact that you, in a fit of rage, because because things are going poorly, right, from Crimea to other points of the world, you simply say, well, we're going to punish you by shutting those all down. Inadvertently, that does reveal, as the Russians say, that the question of chemical weapons is purely a pretext. And I would send everybody to read Seymour Hersh's article, which is somebody who's not a friend of Syria, I don't think, but Seymour Hersh has written about how when Kerry and Obama made that charge back in August and September, they knew that this was a lie. They knew that there was no way Assad could have given that order because apparently the NSA phone taps and other surveillance on Assad was so seamless that any such order would have been detected, and they knew that that had not been done. The mentality of the Saudis, I guess, is also rather unstable, right? This feud that they have with Qatar, this argues for a very unrealistic and perhaps somewhat apocalyptic frame of mind.
Well, it seems like we can't get away, George Lambrakis, from the fallout that right now is happening between Russia and the United States. But Russia is obviously one of the players regarding the Syria equation. How far do you think Russia is going to go in terms of irritating the West, perhaps, on this? I mean, are we looking at material support on the ground? Do you think that that's going to have an effect on how things are going to translate on the ground? Where do you think this fallout is going to lead regarding Russia's moves?
You're asking me, I take it, because the acoustics are not so good here.
Yes.
I would be very surprised that the Russians would get militarily involved in Syria. I think they feel that Assad is doing fine as it is. Lots of Syrians are getting killed, but so what? A lot of them are being chased around, but so what? I think the other speaker, who obviously has done some reading and is a man of a certain amount of wisdom, has slipped into ideology now, attacking Kerry because of what he was a member of at Yale. I think Kerry is an excellent Secretary of State. I think whatever Sy Hersh may have written, which I haven't seen exactly, it may well, it's quite conceivable that Assad's forces used these chemical weapons without necessarily asking permission of Assad. You know, one man isn't running the war in any place. When you have a war like that, people around Assad take a general position and then they go ahead. Sometimes they go further than they're supposed to. But I would be shocked to learn that Assad punished people for using their chemical weapons. There is no question that they used it. Whether you can't find the direct link between Assad and giving that order, heck, that happens. You couldn't find direct orders of Hitler telling people in World War II what to do either. That doesn't mean that Hitler wasn't responsible. Assad is the president, he's got the regime, and he's carrying out a very, very bad war against his own civilians, primarily. Unfortunately, as you said earlier, I think this has to have a political end, or else the war will go on forever. And I don't see Assad prepared to do it, and unfortunately the other side has become even more and more extreme as the war goes on, and who knows where this will all end.
Well, I would imagine...
it's sad for the Syrian people.
I would imagine, Webster Tarpley, that this is very difficult given the fallout between Russia and the West and the U.S. regarding the situation in Ukraine. So I'm going to turn into our focus to the other player that's involved here and see whether this would be a possibility and how Iran could perhaps become more of a player given the fact that you have this fallout with Russia and the U.S. and the West.
Well, certainly the events in Syria, the Syrian army has benefited from certainly advisors and other forms of assistance coming from Iran, which is perfectly understandable, right? That Iran would want to help a friendly and neighboring country. it seems to me right now that the entire world ideological situation has turned over. In other words, it's been transformed now in the past week or two, primarily by the action of Putin in arranging the ingathering of Crimea, as the Russians would put it. That Crimea has now returned to the Russian Federation. I would stress that's a defensive move. That was a response to a fascist coup d'etat in a country which has been the traditional avenue of invasion of Russia from the days of Napoleon and Hitler. So it seems to me now that the Russian foreign ministry has to look at the world and say, well, who is going to be with us and who's going to be against us? And certainly Syria and Iran would be the two countries in the Middle East that would potentially be on the side of Russia. I believe we have recent news of perhaps 2 new contracts for nuclear reactors, which are going to be built with Russian assistance in Iran. I think the fundamental absurdity is that Russia participates in the economic sanctions against Iran. And I remember when I heard that for the first time, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't imagine that kind of folly. And that was back in the days of Medvedev. Perhaps that was the reason. But I don't see how Russia is going to maintain itself in an international sanctions regime against Iran at the same time that you've got the West, the United States and the European Union engaging in these very destructive and really futile economic sanctions against Russia. So I think a lot of in other words, that the anti-imperialist front, if you will, is going to become more solid, and some of those contradictions are going to be pushed aside. Well,
we'd like to find out the game plan here. And George Lambrakis, what could be the game plan? I mean, you have this Saudi Interior Minister, along with the U.S., from what we understand, coordinating their actions on the ground. It also is obviously going to involve Turkey, Qatar, and Jordan. Maybe not Qatar as much based on the fallout. So politically speaking, where is this going? I mean, obviously the Geneva peace talks are a distant memory at this point. What are we looking at? Is the U.S., the West, and Saudi Arabia in particular hoping that militarily they're going to defeat Assad, which means I would think that months of obviously this type of engagement on the ground still to come. Is that what's going to happen? How do you see it?
Well, I think, first of all, that I can't speak for the Saudis. The Saudis are caught up, as is Iran, in this Shia-Sunni battle, really, that's been happening in the Middle East for several years now, and where Syria is the most recent battleground. I'm sorry to hear your other speaker fall into perfectly good communist speak, talking about the United States as the imperial powers and other kind of junk of that sort. I think his ideology needs a little updating compared to what he said before, which wasn't a bad view of where we are today. I think, unfortunately, that nobody really knows how you're going to get out of a situation in which the two sides are battling each other. Neither one of them seems like it's going to win. I don't expect Russia to come in with arms, maybe with arms, but certainly not with military force. And up to now, at least, the Sunnis, particularly the Saudis, have been assisting the other side. The Americans are not going to get drawn into a new Cold War front in Syria, hopefully nowhere else either. Unfortunately, the other observer on this program seemed to think we've already gotten into the Cold War, and that he doesn't understand how Putin isn't lining up every possible person, every possible country on his side. Frankly, I don't think Iran is necessarily going to be on Russia's side. I think it's quite possible that Iran has a different approach And frankly, people who know the Middle East, as I have known it for many years now, know that in the Middle East, pro-American, pro-Russian, pro-this, pro-that goes only so far. People in the Middle East and governments in the Middle East are looking after their own interests, and they can change sides quite quickly, as we have seen it happen in a number of cases already. So frankly, I don't think we're going to solve today how the Syrian situation is going to end. Let's hope that one way or the other, after many years, eventually, both sides will realize that they can't win outright, and they'll have to come to some kind of an arrangement.
Very well. Webster Tarpley, I'm sorry, George Lambrakis, we're just running out of time. In 1 minute or less, a reaction to George Lambrakis in closing.
Well, first of all, the notion of imperialism, if you know anything about the historiography of the 19th century, 20th century, you can't analyze anything unless you realize that there is such a thing as imperialism, and this is not the monopoly of communists, and I'm certainly not a communist. The notion of a political settlement, this may be flawed now, especially after what's happened in the past week. If we look at the American Civil War, there was no political solution. There was a military solution. And that came about because the foreign supporters of the Confederacy, Britain and France, were deterred by Russia from intervening on the side of the South. In the Russian Civil War, it was the Entente powers, mainly Britain and France, but they were prevented from intervening because they were afraid of mass strikes and upheavals at home. So at that point, there was a military solution imposed by the winning side. And it seems to me that given the moribund nature of this Geneva
I'm sorry, we're just fresh out of time. I do apologize. A big thank you to our guest, former U.S. diplomat George Lambrakis, and you're just listening to author and historian Webster Tarpley. Thank you so much for watching another edition of The Debate. Any questions or comments, newsroom@bestTV.ir. From me, Qatar and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.